Well, afternoon. I'm glad you guys could all be here for this exciting development talk. Hopefully exciting. My name is Jay. I am Director of Design and UX here at OOMF. That means that I help lead the visual team through the process of figuring out what a site needs to do, who the audience is that it talks to, what the right visual and interactive experience might be. And I also try to help make sure it looks pretty. And we have some other talented visual designers here who do that as well. So who is OOMF? We are a design-driven development agency. And what I think that means to us is that all of our developers are also designers. We're designers of systems, we're designers of workflows, we're designers of code, basically. And so we try to employ design thinking to solve problems. Design thinking just simply means it's iterative, it's analytical, and an emphasis on creative solutions that are technically smart and visually pleasing at the same time. And what am I responsible for here? Well, I'm kind of the owner of the design process. A process here for us as a development agency, though, means that it needs to be really fluid. I use this idea of a spiral staircase or a corkscrew a lot. It is cyclical. You kind of start and end in a similar spot, but you're moving through space, you're moving through time, and hopefully you are getting to a better spot or a different spot every time you start again, because you've learned something in the past. And so we try to take that and constantly refine the process, and that's a bit of why I'm going through this now, is this idea of prototyping, trying to figure out for us, how do we fit it in, how do we make it make sense, and how can we constantly expand on that. So first I wanted to get kind of the temperature of the room and get a little bit of a sense of who you guys all are. So if you don't mind, who of you guys are a visual designer? You got some visual people? Okay, cool. Who's a designer that also codes? And there might be some overlap there. Got a few? Okay. Who works at an in-house agency? All right. And who's a freelancer? Anyone? Yeah? Okay. Who's have some experience with prototyping, and maybe it's a wireframe tool like Balsamic? Yeah? Okay. All right. And then whose company has sort of a documented process for how they go through design every time? Is it rigid, or is it flexible, or is it just kind of ad hoc? Does anyone have a process in place that they try to follow? No? All right. Well, hopefully you've come to the right place. So first I want to just talk quickly about the value of prototyping. I assume you guys are here because you already think it's valuable. I had that great word in the title, so that drew you in. But I think, how can we explain its values to others in our company is something that's going to come up quite a bit, right? So in a wonderful coincidence, Paul Bogue penned an article earlier this month about this very subject, and I'm gonna borrow from him quite a bit here. He's an influential UX consultant and digital strategist, and he mapped out very well the different points that I tend to agree with. So prototypes can really help solve problems up front. They're a low-cost, low-risk way to map out a new method or new workflow, to storyboard a whole process, to trial test improvements on difficult systems, especially like e-commerce, and then to try to visually explain the differences between mobile and desktop. For me, that's really huge, to try to communicate to clients in a non-static way, in a very fluid way, how your site's going to actually work when we build it. That's the end goal. That's where I really want to try to get to. They can also just validate ideas. Sometimes it's a lot easier to show someone than to explain it. And in this case, they can help gather data really early in the process. It doesn't have to be the end-all, most beautiful design. It just has to work. And with that, you can go out to a small group and get some feedback, collect some data. And that's, we waste too much time debating details, Paul says, when a quick prototype and some ad hoc testing could just resolve the issue. So instead of a bunch of meetings, build a prototype. And then sometimes, I mentioned this a little bit before, people need to see the goal before they can really take that first step. And more often, the proposed cost of a new feature or design improvement kind of clouds the conversation, right? Because money is more tangible than an abstracted idea. So a prototype can help show that value and kind of explain why that cost might be well used. And then finally, I think the biggest thing for us here is collaboration. That's really huge. Too often a designer, they're off in their own world, digesting and synthesizing the content, really getting into the head of the project. And what comes out is beautiful, but it may not explain to our development team why and how and what they need to be thinking about. So being able to show someone how it might work in the end is going to be very powerful. Paul says we can misinterpret words, but a prototype clarifies what the final deliverable should be. And I think that's really quite true. So now that we've got that, I'll go into our current design process, how we try to approach a new project. In general, we like to go from low fidelity to high. And what that means is that oftentimes we really try to start with content if possible. That's really hard to do sometimes, but it really helps drive what we're designing. We need to know what it's going to say, what's the headline, how long is the body copy, what are we dealing with? So often we'll start with a super low fidelity bulleted list of what's going to be on the page, what are the different sections, and this will help drive other things like information architecture and things like that. I think great designs really start with great content, so if we start with lorem ipsum, we're going to have a really uninspired design as a final product. And so we try to avoid that whenever we can. So we try to start there, and then we move into a wireframe. A wireframe introduces a little bit of fidelity. It's meant to be a skeleton, kind of like the scaffolding of a building, and so that helps us start to think about what's going to go where, what's the structure of the page, what are the major components doing, like the header and the navigation, and it doesn't cloud by introducing design details, which can tend to be a honeypot for people. They'll focus right in on you're using the wrong color or you're using the wrong font, and they won't be looking at the big picture. So we try to keep that really basic looking, more like a Greybox. From here, we move into typically a style tile, or sometimes if we've got the project structured right, we're doing that at the same time that we're doing wireframe. So style tile is pretty much the complete opposite. Does anyone ever use them? Everyone know what they are? Yeah, a few? So essentially, if the wireframe is a bunch of 2x4s and steel beams of a building, the style tile is the mood board that the interior designer might come to you with to show you what the room is going to look like. They don't bring in the actual furniture and the hardware and the doors, but they give you fabric swatches, they give you color palettes, they give you photos of what might be sitting in the room, sketches of what things might look like. They're loose, but they have an overall design aesthetic that you're trying to drive towards. So they're a great way to get people, again, to focus on just the design details without worrying about the structure. So those two things running in parallel typically then lead to a design mock-up. So this is what our process looks like typically now for most projects. When the client's finally feeling good about the style tiles and the wireframes, the design mock-ups really try to bring those together. Now with responsive design, of course, this makes it more difficult. You used to be able to pretty much design the entire site in a bunch of static pages, and the client knew exactly what they were going to get. Nowadays, there's too many pages, too many variations. You've got mobile, you've got tablet, you've got desktop, you might have even larger. And so it's really hard to do that in a static way. Instead, what you end up doing is you pick the most important parts and you design those for your most important viewport, probably, usually desktop, sometimes mobile if you're lucky. And then your own design team and your development team have to fill in the gaps. This isn't great, but it does work. It does lead to some confusion sometimes when you're in that final stage, you're getting ready to deliver a product, and the client just wasn't paying attention to what mobile is going to look like. So as much as possible, I'm hoping that prototyping with HTML can start to avoid some of those problems. Finally, if we're lucky, we can start to code. After all these 4 steps, and probably 4 to 6, maybe 8 weeks worth of work, we can actually start to touch HTML and CSS now. Hopefully now we have an idea of what the reusable components of the site might be. We can start to structure the HTML and CSS to be modular, but this is the first time most developers get to look at the site. And that's a problem. Remember the spiral I introduced? I think this is where we can make an improvement. So, for a design-driven development shop like ours, we're certainly giving the visual folks a lot to work with. Where's the code in the process? We've got none of it until the very end. So how can a developer get more involved? I think this is where we want to try to introduce a prototype instead of a static wireframe. And this is the direction I've started to take a few projects here just to test them out. This so far has been able to show not only our client what we're building, but the development team as well. And it lets us test out ideas for really complicated systems like a mobile navigation structure. How better, but with code, can you start to play with how that should actually work? And really, our development team, they want to do their job. They want to get in as soon as possible. And this might be a way to start to do that. So at this point, we're ready to take a little break between ideas. I have to pay homage to one of my design process heroes, Brad Frost, who said this, and I think it's starting to make a lot of sense. There's a big push out there with some of the larger thinkers about doing as much as possible in the browser as soon as possible. And he later followed that up in a Treehouse interview as, it's not for everyone. It may not be for every project. Designing or deciding in the browser, it can still be a powerful tool. It's not the only thing out there for sure. But if you can do it and if it makes sense for that project, I think it's definitely worth a shot. So now we can move into some more concrete examples. Some of you have done some prototyping, but some of you haven't. So I think this is going to be a good overview of the kind of tools you have available to you. And so let's just dive in here. So, Old Faithful is still a big player. Adobe Creative Suite, Illustrator, Photoshop, a lot of times, a lot of the other tools I'll talk about later, they need you to have some designs in place to actually work with. So these guys are still a big player, and later on they're actually working on new tools to help with this process as well. So don't discount continuing to use Illustrator or Photoshop if that's part of your workflow. Of course, if you're one of the cool kids, you might be using Sketch. You might have heard of it. Unlike Adobe, who's had this long legacy print background, Sketch was built as a new tool for web development specifically, for designing in a browser, for designing on screen. So it does have some advantages there. I've used it. I happen not to like it as much. Maybe I'm just too comfortable with Adobe products, but it's definitely one of the up-and-comers on the scene. Not to be outdone, as I mentioned, Adobe has a product called Muse out right now, which I haven't used either, but it seems promising. My problem with it is they don't want you to write code. So maybe it's great for actually getting something that's close to a final product, for doing an MVP when it comes to like a mobile app or something like that, but it's not going to get you usable code in the end. So maybe that's right, again, for some projects, maybe it's not. But that might be something that your design team can fiddle with and drag and drop and not have to worry your development team with. But if you have front-end developers who would rather be doing this sort of work, maybe it's not for you. Then we get into an old favorite of mine, Balsamic, right? It's fun, it's quirky, it's simple. Clients totally get it. They totally get it because it doesn't look like the final product. It just looks like a sketch. and it still has a lot of useful tools for us. Different components that are fairly modular. If you know you want a gallery, you plunk in the gallery widget. If you know you want a particular kind of header, they might have it pre-built. It's a quick way to get some sketches out on screen, and can help also drive some of the products I talk about later. Another newcomer, slightly newcomer, Envision. Has anyone heard of Envision? Yeah? It is pretty cool. It has a really nice interface. The problem is you can't actually design in it. It's made for prototyping only. Specifically very well for mobile, and what it does very well. I've used it to take Balsamic mock-ups, export those as PNGs, and bring them into this tool. It makes, and then some of the niceties it has is like it'll send your users, your testing group, an email or an SMS message with the link in it, so they can pull it up on their phone really easily. They don't have to type in a strange URL, and it lets you poke around. It lets you use navigation if you can mock that up. It's an extra layer of work essentially, but it does let you get to a point where you can take something like that and test it. What Balsamic doesn't do very well, unfortunately, is animations and other things that really add to value to the user experience. It lets you click through mockups, but it doesn't do a lot of the stuff that people expect to see now, like adhesive navigation or swiping menu items on mobile, things like that. It's not a great responsive tool. So Envision kind of bridges that gap a little bit. After I looked into those tools, first, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention testing in some way. Again, there's a lot of great testing suites out there, but I can say that one of the ones we've had a lot of great luck with is called Validately. It's nice because it sits on top of all sorts of other files. It can sit on top of Envision, it can sit on top of a prototype, and what it helps you do actually, you come up with a list of tasks you want someone to perform, and it just guides the user through doing that. It records them doing that, it does heat maps, it lets you know how long it took to take a certain task, so you can really drill down and see where your workflow might be falling down. You can find out where people are getting stuck, you can find out if they're clicking on the wrong thing, they're going down one path and they have to back up because they're going the wrong way. It's very useful, and it doesn't have to be done only on a final site. It could be part of an A/B testing suite where you're actually using it on a live site as well, but I've used it with that Envision thing that I talked about. So unfortunately there's a lot of layers there. You're doing wireframes in Balsamic, then you're bringing them into Envision, and then you're testing them with Validately. It's a lot of layers, but it did happen to work pretty well for that project. Recently, in the past year or so, I've started to use the new up-and-comer UXPin. Anyone heard of that one? I'm starting to see ads for this now in my Facebook feed too, so they're pushing it hard. I had mixed feelings about this product, I'll be honest. They're trying to do everything, which is nice. They're trying to be Balsamic and be Envision, and they even have a testing suite that's in beta right now. So they have a lot of interesting stuff. They have a lot to offer, but for me, it's also, they're in like move fast and break stuff mode, so it's a little buggy sometimes. I end up pounding the desk quite a bit because it won't do what I want it to do, and it doesn't act like other products that I think it should act like. So it is a little bit of a source of frustration as well, but it does some cool stuff. So. The UI of this thing is huge. It doesn't work well on a laptop. You really need a second monitor for it. But you can see you've got a sitemap of all the pages you want to be working within. You've got libraries of different elements similar to Balsamic. You can drag and drop and build pages with them. You can also create your own custom libraries. You can bring images in and such. On the other side, there's canvas properties, type controls, things like that. There's a little bit of interactivity built in now. You can get smart objects that will open and close and show and hide. And I think the biggest thing that it does well is it integrates responsive versions right into it. You can create a new adaptive version of the same layout, so you basically have one document to store your desktop, your tablet, your mobile sketches. Unfortunately, they're all separate. And when you're viewing them, you can't like change the browser window and it'll switch from one to the other yet. Maybe they're working on that, I don't know. But it does let you put everything in one place. The problem I've had with Balsamic is you usually have one sketch with one artboard and then another sketch with another artboard, and they're all the same but they're not together. That can get a little bit cumbersome. And then for the clients, what they really like about it is when you're viewing it in a browser, all that cruft goes away, but there's inline commenting, which is really nice. So you can, we just dropped our Photoshop sketches into UXPin, didn't do anything fancy with them, but it let us set up a sitemap similar to their final. They can get a sense now. They're clicking through from one page to another. You can put hotspots on it if you want to, so that'll go to the About page, things like that. And the commenting is really nice. So it gets you to sign off quicker. It lets you have a conversation on the design instead of in a presentation or somewhere else, Basecamp or something like that. And then you can resolve comments as well. So it kind of acts like a to-do list. That I do like quite a bit, and the clients have been really, really receptive to it as well. So, great tool, has its own problems, but probably worth looking into if you don't have a workflow that you think can support a true HTML kind of prototype. My problem with all this, my frustration has been that I've spent so much time learning the tool, I could have been coding. I could have been building an HTML prototype, right? So, and that's kind of the problem. I enjoy learning these things, I enjoy using these new tools, but in the end, I just want usable code. I want to help these guys build a new site as much as possible. I don't want to be like anyone else with Photoshop, stuck in a room pumping out really nice things that aren't useful to the other end of the actual development process. So that's what led me into thinking about this stuff more and more. So, how do you do that? Building HTML prototypes there's not like a great one tool out there you can go and grab. There's a number of different ways you can do it. So it's really going to depend on what you want to get out of it in the end. So some ways you can get started, like help jumpstart yourselves. There's a lot of CSS frameworks, right? You don't want to bother with, or if you know you're not going to have ultimate control over the markup anyway, go and get Bootstrap, go and get Foundation. Download one of these frameworks where you don't have to think so much about the components and the overall structure. You can just work on building. For us, that doesn't work as well because we don't get the code that we want in the end. But for front-end developers who are really good at these things and really quick, it'll allow you to get a prototype much more quickly and responsive as well. What we're a fan of instead is a SAS library. So we've decided on Bourbon, but I've also used Compass in the past. Those are just two. But there's quite a few of these kinds of things out there, and what they do is they just help you write normal CSS, and they deal with the fallbacks, and they deal with all the extra extensions and all the things that you just don't have the brain space for anymore. So if you don't remember what the different Flexbox properties are anymore, I highly suggest using one of these libraries to help you write SAS. What they're going to do is just let you concentrate on the end goal, and they'll take care of the fallbacks and the old browser stuff on the build side of things. Bourbon, incidentally, we ended up liking better just because it's more lightweight. Compass was great when it came out, but I feel like they're trying to do way too many things, and it's slow. Bourbon has been nicer because it's just a smaller library and it lets you customize things a little bit more easily. But we can talk ad nauseum about that later if you like. And then so the things I miss about development when I was thinking about this and how to go about it were having a local host environment, quickly being able to spin up a new project. And so I found Jekyll. Has anyone heard of Jekyll? I know you have. So a static site generator means that you get to use all of the things that you might already be comfortable with. Anyone develop with like PHP, something like that? Right? So you've got includes, you can take other files, you can have little partials, you can You don't have to build every single page from scratch every time. A static site generator takes all of those powerful features from a scripting language, but spits out simple HTML. So the nice part about that is you can take that folder of your rendered site and plunk it on a server and let your client look at it. You can do a local development environment until you're ready to push that up to a server. You can do a lot of different things and still make things reusable. You don't end up wasting a lot of time repeating the same, and then it's hard to make a change, etc. So this is a very interesting tool as well, that I'll show you actually some examples of in a demo later. Jekyll ended up being kind of a gateway drug for me to other static site generators. And I haven't used this one yet, but I'm really interested in it. It's called Sculpin. They all have crazy names, by the way. So with this, the reason why this one is interesting to me, like Jekyll is built on Ruby. Jekyll is actually what came out of GitHub, and it's what runs github.io, which is their static site pages for all sorts of different projects. Sculpin is built on PHP. So if you already have an environment like us where you work on Drupal projects, you work on WordPress projects, starting with PHP might be really great. It might get me closer to the final project because I'm in the same language, I'm in the same environment as the rest of the development team. The other nice thing about it is it's starting to leverage a front-end framework library called Twig. Twig is just another abstraction layer basically, but it makes templating a little bit easier and a little bit more like programming rather than HTML, and I'll show you some of that as well. The reason why that's interesting is that Twig was just introduced into Drupal 8 core, so Twig is now the templating engine for Drupal, and WordPress seems to be moving in that direction with a plugin that's called Timber right now, but a lot of people are expecting them to take it on as well. So if I can get a prototyping tool that's really close to our end environment, there might be even more code that can get reused in the final product, and that's really what I'm trying to move towards. So that's a quick an overview of the different kind of tools. So our process right now, and our process, what I want our process to be. Right now, I have a project called Gray Matter. Gray Matter is it's open on GitHub. If you find me on GitHub, you can have access to this. It's built on Jekyll, so it's my first foray into sort of a prototyping toolkit. And what it does for me is it just gives me a quick starter place to get going with a new project. It's got everything needed just to drag and drop and get started. The Readme is pretty good, even if you're a novice. I myself am not great with coding in the terminal and things like that, so the Readme for this project helps you spin something up yourself. What it does that I think is pretty nice is it includes Sass globbing, which means that it basically takes an entire folder and just watches the whole folder. You don't have to list out every single file that you wanted to use. That's really sweet, especially when you're in rapid start. And it lets you use those includes that I mentioned. So you can build a header separately and pull it in. You can build a footer separately and pull it in. It supports Markdown or raw HTML, which a lot of people are more familiar with. Markdown is just kind of a non-HTML way to structure content, and that might make writing content for people that aren't interested in writing HTML a little bit quicker. It's got a built-in local host, as I mentioned, and it's got a compiled folder that you can drop onto a server, as I mentioned before. So this is a great way to get up and running. Internally, because this is ongoing, we have a Sass starter kit, and this could be CSS as well, but basically we've documented and internalized where we want our developers to start every time they have a new project and they start on a new front-end theme. What that has done for us is just help us track and keep on top of functions that we want to use for every single project, mixins that we want to use for every single project, dedicate a file structure and stick to it. For a team, that makes a lot of sense. You don't want every project to be set up in a different way every single time. So this is a way, at least for the front end team, we always know where things are, we always know how to get started. So I think between these two things, a prototyping toolkit and a kind of a SaaS framework that you can just drop in and start playing with, that helps me or anyone else on the team start developing a prototype as soon as possible. So now, it's demo time. So this is where, the rubber hits the road, right? I'll move into so this is Greybox. I'm going to start showing you an actual project that I built, and it was interesting because we skipped the design mockup stage. We went. Client had some ideas. They wanted them executed. I started building this project as a proof of concept. Because it was close enough, because we could use their branded colors, because we could start to use their logo, the design was sort of there. It wasn't finished, but they could see where it might go. So I'll show you where the wireframe ended up looking like, and then what the final product ended up looking like. But this here is the structure of my gray matter site. It's just a couple folders at the top level, and then individual pages are just HTML files. What this allows me to do with layouts, I'll jump over it here, in a very reusable sort of way, is define a layout. To define where my header goes, where my content goes, where my footer goes, and make those pieces reusable. But this is all HTML. I'm not doing anything that requires any server-side scripting. This can all be done locally. In fact, I have this up and running right now. So, in theory, here's my local host, and here's a page that I'm looking at. So this was built in my prototyping tool. This has responsiveness built in. This lets me test out mobile patterns, things like that. This lets me really work with the actual content they've got. I'm just hot linking to files on their live site as a way of saying, this is what this could look like. These are your actual product photos as they stand now. Take them into this new design, this new structure, and take them for a more in-depth test spin. We had this concept of these really big cards, right? And hard to explain this, easy to do it in Photoshop, but wouldn't it be great if I could show them what some of the interactivity might look like, the hover effects, how the buttons might work. It's a great proving ground for them as well as us. In the end, how much of this code could get reused in the final product and help make the front-end theming process go a lot more smoothly. And I'll show you just how things run really quickly. So if I bring up my terminal here, and I say I'm going to turn this outline on and save it. You'll see some bunch of stuff go. Now it's done. I refresh, and I've got that ugly green outline. And it's really that quick, because it's just spitting out HTML files. It takes everything, it compiles your CSS for you, it compiles the HTML, and you can see those changes live. And I'm still in my local host environment. I could take this on a plane, on a train. I don't need an internet connection to work on this. It's really quite nice. As I said before, if you do want to drop this onto a server somewhere, you can certainly do that. So this is the home page. This is where they could review ideas that we were working on. They could review how a slider might work, how this idea of homepage cards might end up going. This is all just stock photography, placeholder stuff. But this kind of idea led to what we'll be launching, I think, in about 2 weeks. Led to this site now. So you can see where a lot of this stuff translated. Now they got an idea of what their imagery could do. Now they have an idea of what the interactivity looks like. And they've started actually to redo all their photography because now we've got a much bigger canvas for them to work with than their previous site. So they had to really start to think long and hard about what their product photography actually starts to look like. So here's that landing page that I showed you before, and we switched up the grid structure, but the idea is still here. And then you go into an individual product page, and again, some of the stuff it allowed us to do is not only the responsiveness of a page like this, what happens for mobile, what's the shopping experience for a product like this, but how do things like adhesive menu bars work? You know, how much of the viewport do they end up covering up? This is all HTML, CSS, so we can do everything we would do in a later on in a production environment. But because it's not in Drupal or WordPress, we're not fighting against the CMS. We're not. We're creating our own dummy content if we need to. We're pulling content off their live site if we have to. We just want to see how it works. You can't add anything to cart right now, of course, but this gets them to a really good spot. If I jump back to my Jekyll project, you know, when I mentioned before about includes and twig, this is what some of the variables and things start to look like. It's a little bit more plain English than programming usually looks, but you can still do some pretty powerful stuff. For instance, there's some simple if-else statements in the title. If this is the home page, spit out the site name. If it's not, spit out the page title. You can still do a lot of that stuff here to make it really mirror what a final production environment looks like. And even more interestingly, with this is a YAML. It's called Liquid, I think. But essentially, it's a way to pass a variable from one page to another. So what's the URL of this page? What's the title of this page? That really kind of simple stuff that makes something feel more like the final product. That can all be done here as well. So I've had a lot of fun playing with this. It's a really interesting tool. And if you're a data nerd, you can start to really do some interesting structured content stuff here and build pages on the fly based on structured data. If you know, it's just a concept right now, but I've seen people do that and then turn those into content types for their content management system. So you can really start to prove data structure as well as visual structure and responsive structure as well. So this is where I'm trying to take the company. We are moving in baby steps. We've done it with one project right now. It doesn't work for every project, but I think more and more as we refine our own internal tools and work with things with platforms like this, I think it can really become something a lot more useful and something we can spend less time in a static tool and more time in an interactive tool like this. So I threw a lot of stuff at you guys, and now I'm ready to open it up for questions or other experiences that you guys have. So thanks for listening.
I can see how developers would want to jump in prototyping,
Yeah.
obviously, rather than wireframing. Do you have clients that prefer one style over another, or some that are just really more comfortable with signing off on a wireframe first?
Since I've only used it a handful of times, I can't say definitively, but I can say that for this client, showing it to their higher ups in this environment, which was really low risk, low cost to them, made a big impact, made a big deal. To be able to, you know, their current site doesn't have these big images, these big landing pages, this kind of more storytelling approach. That's a big shift from where they were. So to be able to show their CEO something like this in a browser, show it on their phone, etc., that did make a big deal, and it did make it much easier to sell the idea. So for that, I would say, yeah, definitely. I would love to ditch UXPin. As much as I think it's interesting, I'd love to ditch it for this if I could figure out how to get commenting into this. If I could find, you know, get one of our developers to help me out. I would love you to be able to highlight a section, highlight a div or an image, leave a comment on it, and then have that conversation in the wireframe. I think if we could do that, then we would be almost 100% there.
What was the impetus for them wanting to do a redesign, and where are the areas where you think you're improving existing
Sure. So their current site, for this in particular, their current site had some interesting stuff to it. We didn't change things drastically. They did have this kind of wall of images, but their navigation is not great. It's a little weird that the logo's off on the wrong side. Search is in the center. I think not where you would expect it to be. You've got their product is structured in a different way, so they've got these product lines. If you go to, these are just big drop downs, which are kind of don't even scroll. Look at that. So it's just a little bit harder to navigate, and because they were an e-commerce site, they had a lot of problems with the shopping experience. So there were a lot of more nitpicky things that we worked on here, and because we could do it, I think in part because we could do it in the browser and show them something working, it went from just let's improve the navigation and improve the shopping experience to let's redesign the whole site. I think we started to show them what the potential was pretty quickly, and it was something that just felt more tangible to them.
Right.
Yeah.
I think the comment before you and Matt were talking about adding comments
Yeah.
to this kind of workflow would be helpful. You know, we work with copywriters a lot.
Oh, right.
Picturing them getting into code to make edits, which would be scary, but having that comment box there, you know, you
Sure.
send out your link to copywriters and have them.
And actually, that may not be so bad. Let me see if I can pull up a version. One of these is in Markdown. Oh, okay. So if they know what Markdown is, this and it's actually really easy to use. There's a number of guides out there. There's something else that came out of GitHub, but it's just plain text. And you can see how links are written. This means that it'll be a H2 because there's 2 hashes in front of it. You can do H1s through H6s. You can do underscores that'll make in a horizontal rule. It's a simple text way to design a page. So if you did have a bunch of copywriters that were able to get into a project like this on GitHub, pull down their own version, run it, make edits, this, I think, removes that barrier because it doesn't look like this, So for something that's really copy heavy, you could structure this in such a way that all of the content pulls from Markdown files and they don't have to worry about HTML at all.
Have you had proofreading happen
I have not.
in code or in
No, not yet. But certainly with UXPin and commenting, that was one of the biggest things we would get. It's like, oh, change this word. Oh, change this image. They weren't necessarily about the design because design, I think, was there. They were starting to see the content now and see the things that they wanted to improve there. So that's why I think commenting was a really big part of that. So being able to either have someone directly edit or suggest edits via some sort of commenting system on a live site would be awesome. Yeah. Well, I'll be available if you have anything you want to talk about one-on-one. I've got business cards and we've got stickers and stuff. If you want to grab anything, feel free to get a notebook or more lunch if you like, certainly. Hang out for a little bit longer, but thanks for coming.